after looking at subject and predicate in the last two videos, and they're sort of the big parts of sentence structure, now we're going to start to get a little bit into smaller versions of sentence pieces. And the first example of that is the clause. A clause is a group of words that contains both a subject and a predicate. Now you might think to yourself, well, if something contains both a subject and predicate, wouldn't it be a sentence? Well, not necessarily. Clauses can be smaller things. They're pieces of sentences. But first we're going to start with the independent clause, and that can be a sentence. It is a clause that can stand alone as a sentence. Let's take a look at an example sentence. She could not hand in her essay, comma, which was not nearly complete. So let's just look at the part in green. Is it a clause? Does it have a subject and a predicate? Well, the subject, it's a pronoun subject, but the subject is she. And does it have a predicate? Yeah. Could not hand in her essay. Predicate. So it's got a subject and a predicate. That makes it a clause. Now, what makes it an independent clause is that if we took that comma out and put a period instead, and we just take this away, could this first part be a sentence? She could not hand in her essay, period. Yeah. It could be a sentence by itself. That makes it an independent clause because it could stand on its own, independent of anything else. But there is also such a thing as a dependent clause. And a dependent clause is a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence. It must combine with an independent clause to form a sentence. And dependent clauses are sometimes referred to as subordinate clauses. So now if we look at the other part of that sentence, she could not hand in her essay, which was not nearly complete. Does it have a subject and a predicate? Well, yeah. Which would be the subject, and was not nearly complete would be the predicate. So it's got a subject and a predicate. It's a clause. But could it stand on its own? If we cut this part out and capitalize the W, it would read, which was not nearly complete. Could that stand as a sentence on its own? No. It must have something else. And the thing it must have is the beginning part of this. It's got to have this part. With this, it's a complete idea. She could not hand in her essay, which was not nearly complete. So we have, in this sentence, we have both an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. But there are two clauses. So let's look at some other example. See if you can identify the clauses in this sentence. If I hear that song one more time, I'm going to jam an ice pick in my ear. What are the clauses? Well, the main clause would start here. I am going to jam an ice pick in my ear. This is the independent clause because it could stand on as a sentence on its own. If you just started the sentence there, I'm going to jam an ice pick in my ear, that's a sentence. So that's an independent clause. But this is also a clause up here. I hear that song. So I would be the subject of that part of this of that clause. And it's got a predicate too, just as this one does. But this one, if we just started the sentence there, if I hear that song one more time, it's unfinished. It's a dependent clause. It needs the rest of the sentence to make sense. So we have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. Next example. As Joe listened to Clara discuss her reasons for dumping him, he began to weep piteously. So in this example, this first part is a clause. Joe listened to Clara discuss blah, blah, blah. Joe would be the subject. The rest of this would be the predicate. So we have a subject and predicate. That makes it a clause. But is it independent or is it dependent? As Joe listened to Clara discuss her reasons for dumping him, it's unfinished. It needs more, so it's dependent. And we have the second clause here. He began to weep piteously. He would be the subject, began to weep piteously would be the predicate, so it's a clause. But it could also stand on its own. He began to weep piteously. So that makes it an independent clause. So again, we have a dependent followed by an independent clause. And the last example. I will go home when someone gives me a ride. Now, unlike the other two examples, this one doesn't have a comma to give you a clue where the clauses separate. Here we have a clause, I will go home, subject, predicate, and here we have another clause, subject, predicate. This would be the independent clause, I will go home. That could stand on its own as a sentence. When someone gives me a ride. Now that kind of clause is a relative clause, which we'll get into later. But anyway, there are two clauses in this sentence as well. Next time, we'll start looking at phrases. So see you then.